Well, good morning, everyone. It's terrific that so many people have joined us for this webinar. Today, we're going to be looking at the issues for older women without children. Are they better off financially or not? So a very big welcome to Council on the Ageing's webinar. So we'll be talking about and looking at the financial security for single, older women without children. My name is Joan Hughes, and I am the President of Council on the Ageing New South Wales. This is a discussion that Council on the Ageing New South Wales have been wanting to have for quite some time. Myra Hamilton, who is our guest speaker today, who's done this research and is on the board of Council on the Ageing, so one of my fellow board directors, she finished this, I think it was published in November of last year. And so it's a huge topic that we need to actually address. Before I get started, I would like to acknowledge the First Nations people, wherever you are joining us today. They are the traditional custodians of this land on where we're having our webinar. I would like to pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I extend that respect to First Nations people who are with us today. So who is Council on the Ageing? Just in case you don't know, it stands for, we always say COTA, but it's Council on the Ageing, and we are the peak organisation for people over 50 in New South Wales. We do a lot of policy and advocacy work. So we're working all the time with politicians, with policymakers, with service providers and the media to make sure that the views of older people are heard and acted on. And that's probably getting more and more difficult as politicians change their ideas, and we've all been consumed by COVID, of course, but we have to make sure that older people's issues are heard and acted on. And today we're talking about a particular group of older people, single women without children, and their issues for their financial security now and into the future. COTA New South Wales, we also provide services for older people, including the Legal Pathways Program, the Aged Care Navigator Service, Strength for Life, and the Community Speakers Program. So please, when you've got some time, check out our website and you'll see the sort of work that we're involved with on a daily basis. For those of you who haven't been part of a Zoom meeting or a webinar, there are just a few things that we need to make sure that occurs so that we can keep everything on time, and we do plan to finish at noon. So everyone except the presenters are on mute. So you can't actually unmute yourself, as this is a webinar, it's not a meeting. We have a Q&A panel, and you can ask questions at any time by typing them into the Q&A panel. You can upvote someone else's question if they're asking something that you would really like to know. We'll be answering questions during the panel discussion, so I'll be leading some of the questions, but please feel free to ask a question in the Q&A. We've added some polls into the presentation just to give everyone a chance to participate. All the polls are anonymous. No one can see what you've answered, but please participate. This makes it a little bit more interactive. And there's also a chat panel, as you'll see at the bottom of your screen, where you can make a comment during the presentation. So let's get underway. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the fellow board director of Council on the Ageing New South Wales, Associate Professor Myra Hamilton. Myra is the Principal Research Fellow at the ARC Centre of Excellence in Population Ageing Research at the University of New South Wales. Myra's research has covered a lot of issues, but in particular retirement income policy, welfare reform, the policy needs of parents and unpaid family carers, including, and this is when I first got to know Myra, she did some fantastic work about grandparent family carers, and the dynamics of work and care over the life course of particular people. The paper that Myra will be presenting to us today, and then we'll have a Q&A session to talk a little bit more in depth, was released, as I said, in November last year. It is the first of its kind, looking at the economic security of single, older women, and has busted the myth that women without children have uninterrupted careers and healthy retirement savings. I'm so looking forward to Myra's presentation. So Myra, over to you. She's been with us on the board since 2019.
Thanks, Joan, and thanks to COTA New South Wales and the Older Women's Network for having me here today to talk about this new research I conducted with my collaborators at UNSW and Curtin University. I used to be at the University of New South Wales, but I'm now at the University of Sydney. The research was funded by one of CPA Australia's Global Research Perspectives Program grants. Sorry about this. Let me just, there we go. So I'd like to start by asking, why is this important? Well, Australia's population is ageing. Women are much more likely than men to live in poverty in old age, especially single women. At the same time, older single women are the fastest growing group experiencing homelessness in Australia. So improving the economic security of single older women should be a policy priority. Most research into the reasons behind single older women's economic insecurity focuses on the motherhood penalty, or the effects of having and rearing children on women's labour market participation, incomes and retirement incomes. But recent estimates suggest that over 20% of Australian women will not have children. Little is known about older single women who don't have children, including how they're faring leading up to and after retirement. To what extent, when children are removed from the equation, do gender inequalities persist? So in the research I present today, we set out to fill this gap. What did we do? Well, to explore these questions, we did a review of existing research and national legislation to examine what's known about the financial security of older single women without children and the possible impacts of policy settings on their financial security. We did analysis of Australia's nationally representative Household Income and Labour Dynamics in Australia survey, the Hughes survey. Our analysis focused on people aged 45 and above, and we compared single women without children in this age group with 7 other demographic groups of women and men, partnered and unpartnered with and without children, to understand how all these different variables had an impact on financial security. We did an online community with 45 older single women without children. And an online community is a bit like a big online focus group, which lasts 3 days to capture the lived experience of this group of women. And we did interviews with 10 financial advisors and housing specialists to better understand the challenges for and support needs of older single women without children navigating the tax and transfer and housing systems. So who are older single women without children? Well, single women without children are women who do not currently have a partner and have not had children. Our study focused on single women without children aged 45 and above, because that's the age range used by the Australian Bureau of Statistics to identify what they call mature workers, an age above which people begin to experience age-related challenges in the labour market. We analysed the National Hughes survey, which is broadly representative of the Australian population, focusing on the 45,000 respondents to the survey who were aged 45 and over. And we found that of women aged 45 and over, 33% were single, 9% did not have children, and 5% were both single and did not have children. So the financial security of older single women without children is affected by the combination of their age, gender, not having a partner, and not having children, and of course, other factors like socioeconomic status. Our research challenged some popular misconceptions about this cohort. So I'd like to go through 4 of those with you today. Popular misconception 1, that older single women must have uninterrupted careers because they don't have childcare responsibilities. In our study, all older single women without children reported that not having children could increase employment opportunities and accelerate career progression. This was because women without children were in a position, the participants told us, to be more flexible in their career decisions and daily work patterns than women with children. They were able to more flexibly meet their employers' needs and more easily participate in networking opportunities outside of working hours, both important contributors to career progression. They reported that being single and not having children was viewed by employers as a positive attribute. But according to our participants, while not having children sometimes created employment opportunities and meant that they didn't have career interruptions associated with having children, they still experienced career interruptions. 2/3 of the participants in our sample had experienced an extended involuntary career interruption because of ill health, redundancy, or care responsibilities for ageing relatives and others. Our analysis of Hilda supported this finding. In spite of not having children, the data suggests that single women without children do experience career interruptions, but rather than occurring early in their working life, these interruptions are more likely to be concentrated later in life. Single women without children have longer working lives than mothers, but shorter working lives on average than all groups of men, children or no children. According to the older women in our online community, when these career interruptions did occur, the impacts were severe, as there was no second income to cushion the financial shock. So while the women in our study did not have career interruptions associated with having children, many nonetheless had career interruptions, particularly as they aged, and the impacts of an involuntary career interruption in later life could be disastrous. Popular misconception 2. Older single women without children must have healthy incomes and super balances because they haven't had career interruptions associated with having children. We did find that not having children was associated with higher personal incomes than having children. Our analysis of Hilda revealed that single women without children have higher personal incomes than mothers. But the advantages of not having children for financial security are overshadowed by the disadvantages of being single. Our analysis of Hilda suggests that partnered people do better than single people on all other measures of income and wealth. Partnered people have higher equivalised household incomes, higher personal superannuation wealth, and higher household net wealth than single people. The only group doing worse than single women without children on these measures is single people with children. This is because there are financial benefits of being in a couple. The first is economies of scale. Couples can pool resources, and as a result, the cost of living per person is lower. Another potential benefit of being in a couple is extra disposable income that can be invested in superannuation, the housing market, or other assets. Having a spouse or partner is also a protective factor when it comes to financial hardship. Single people are more likely than partnered people, according to Hilda, to be unable to pay a utility bill on time or to ask for financial help from friends or family. So while not having children increased the earnings potential of single women without children, this did not translate into better financial security in later life because being single limited their opportunities to accumulate superannuation and wealth. Popular misconception 3, it must be easier to find housing with the extra flexibility and income associated with not having children. The participants in our online community identified benefits of not having children in negotiating the housing market, such as more flexibility, the need for less space, and the perception that landlords may think they're cleaner tenants. But again, the advantages of not having children for housing choices were overshadowed by the disadvantages of being single. Our analysis of Hilda suggests that single women without children have lower levels of home ownership than partnered people with or without children. Again, the only group doing worse is single people with children. According to the participants in our online community, being single prevented some of them from acquiring a home loan. Others simply didn't try because they felt they wouldn't be approved on a single income. The barriers to securing a home loan intensified as they aged, permanently locking some out of the housing market. While homeowners in our study felt more financially secure than renters, they also experienced a sense of precariousness in their housing arrangements because they were on one income. Some felt compromised in their capacity to continue paying rates, strata fees, and upkeep of their properties, especially as they aged and their incomes decreased. Several homeowners reported wanting to downsize or move to a property that better accommodated their declining health, but said a drop in their income as they aged had prevented them from remortgaging. About 1 in 5 of them who were homeowners reported renting out a room of their house to a housemate or placing a room on Airbnb to help manage the costs. According to the participants in our study, being single could also be a barrier to obtaining a rental property without the extra income and security of a second earner. For some, their pets were their family, but those pets presented an added barrier to finding appropriate rental accommodation. Like when they lost their job, the lack of a second potential earner meant that if single women without children could not pay rent, they did not have the safety net of a spouse, and the effects could cascade into extreme housing insecurity very quickly. These challenges gave many older single women without children the sense of having limited housing choices available to them, even when they had reasonable means. For older single women without children, therefore, while there were some small benefits to not having children, many still experienced strong barriers to finding and maintaining appropriate housing, mostly associated with being single and worsening as they aged. The final popular misconception: older single women without children must be freer and more flexible with their time because they don't have childcare responsibilities. Our analysis of Hilda suggests that older single women without children are much more likely than any other group over 45, including partnered women and men with and without children and single parents, to be caring for an older relative or a relative with a disability or chronic illness. In our online community, older single women without children with care responsibilities reported that this was because their families viewed them as unencumbered by childcare responsibilities and therefore freer and more flexible with their time. As a result, there were family expectations that they take on primary care responsibilities for ageing parents, for example, often resulting in interruption to their employment and earnings. At the same time, they reported that their employers also held the view that they were unencumbered by childcare responsibilities, and this meant that their employers sometimes expected more of them at work than they did of parents with children. Participants reported that this could lead to extra pressure by their employers on their personal and non-work time, such as being asked to stay back late when others had left early to pick up children, or being told they couldn't take annual leave over certain holiday periods because parents with school-aged children had priority. This was in spite of the fact that many had care responsibilities for ageing parents and other family members. Some older single women without children were therefore being squeezed from both angles, as both employers and families viewed them as freer and more flexible with their time. This could set up circumstances in which older single women without children faced excessive pressure that affected their work-life balance and their health and well-being. So what about their own care needs? Well, while not having children could be an advantage in personal earnings, for example, there was one area in which both being single and not having children combined to generate challenges and anxiety for the older single women in our study. That was when their own health and aged care needs arose. About a third of our sample reported having chronic health conditions themselves, which affected their capacity to work, earn and save. For most, living alone or with roommates during periods of ill health meant they had limited access to the day-to-day care and support they needed with recovery, treatment, transport and household tasks. Some reported that this actually prolonged their absence from work. Participants also expressed a strong fear about growing older and not knowing who would be there to support and care for them in the future. They were concerned that without a spouse or children of their own, they would not have any informal support to help them remain living at home in the community as they aged. Participants had considered varied approaches to meeting these needs in the absence of immediate family. Some talked about close relationships with nieces and nephews, indicating they hoped they would provide support as they got older. Some planned to pay for private support. But others were very concerned that they may have to give up on their desire to continue living independently in the community and move into a residential aged care facility prematurely. So in conclusion, for older single women without children, opportunities for financial security and well-being emerge at the intersections of 4 axes of inequality: being a woman, being single, not having children, and being mature-aged. Older single women with and without children experience considerable challenges to their financial security. They face challenges to earning, accumulating superannuation and wealth, and securing appropriate housing, all challenges associated with their gender, their age, and their relationship status. Men, younger people, and partnered people do better. These challenges persist among older single women without children. While single women without children do better on these outcomes than single women with children, they still do worse than all groups of partnered people and all groups of men. And there's one area in which older single women without children do worse than older single women with children: the area of aged care. Older single women without children are more likely to take on care responsibilities for aging parents and other relatives, precisely because they don't have children. What's more, because they don't have children, they are anxious and concerned about how their own care needs will be met in future. So in sum, older single women are a group experiencing disadvantage and discrimination that compromises their capacity for financial security in later life. Older single women without children experience similar challenges and some additional ones. As a result, policymakers need to better understand and respond to the different layers of insecurity and inequality that women experience as they age across workplaces, housing, retirement incomes policy, and care services. Thank you.
Myra, thank you very much. I've just had a little problem with my computer. People say that it's shaking a little bit, so I'm not quite sure about that. So bear with me. I'm trying to stabilise it a little bit. So Myra, you know, the thing that really spoke to me I really like the way that you talked about all of the misconceptions, and that's that myth busting, which I think is so important. But isn't it dreadful when we think about it? So I find it shocking that the older women without children, all of the issues around inequality, poverty, lack of appropriate housing, but most importantly, what you said regarding who's going to care for them. And I think that does create a lot of insecurity for older women. And I think that's actually a big shame on our society that should occur. As many of the people who are joining us today would be well aware of the caring responsibilities, I'm sure, and how often the single older women are so-called the chosen ones in families to actually provide the care for older parents and older relatives. I think one of the things that also spoke to me, which I hadn't really thought about, was some of the issues to do with chronic illnesses, and I wondered whether, just a question to you, whether that included mental health issues as well.
Yes, it did. And this was something that many of the women in our study spoke about quite extensively. A number of them had experienced considerable prolonged career interruptions associated with chronic mental illness. And part of the reason it had been so difficult for them to manage was their lack of support. They lived alone, and at the time when they required the greatest support in order to be able to manage in terms of the treatment of their illness, but also the kind of day-to-day managing a household was extremely difficult for them. And as I mentioned, this really prolonged their absence from work. And then the kind of flow-on impacts on their financial security in the present and in the future.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, those issues to do with the interruption of work and therefore the interruption of things like superannuation and having that financial security as you get older and move out of the paid workforce.
That's right.
Issues around housing, obviously very, very, very important.
Very, very important. And certainly, I mean, in this component of the study, this was probably the area in which the participants described the greatest kind of contributor to their financial insecurity as they aged. And for us, combining the analysis we did of Hilda and the discussions we had with older single women without children in the online community, housing was a very big concern of theirs, and mostly the concern, as I mentioned, was around being single and having to manage the costs of housing on a single income, and the kind of speed with which an interruption to their income could lead to housing insecurity and homelessness.
Yes, and I think part of that discussion is also to do with the lack of housing options for people, and we know that there's such a huge waiting list for options to do with social housing. All right, Myra, that's it's hard to listen to, but we do very much thank you for doing the research. Now, folks, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our panelists. Look at all these wonderful women that you can all see. So these people are going to start the discussion. I'm going to suggest a few questions that have come out of Myra's research just to get the conversation happening. And remember that you can also type in a question in the Q&A section. So firstly, I'd like to introduce, and I'm just going to use first names because you can see the names on the screen. The first person I'd like to introduce is Kay. And most people would know, I think, that Kay is the Aged Discrimination Commissioner. And when you started that was 2016, I think, Kay, you became the Age Discrimination Commissioner. But also Kay's had a large career in politics in Victoria and was the Minister for Health and Ageing between 2001 and 2003. Kay will talk about the issues within her current role that she thinks are very important, but she has done a lot of work in the area of elder abuse and innovative solutions to homelessness, especially for older people. So welcome, Kay. It's great to have you here. The next person I'd like to introduce is Elka, and Elka is the CEO of SydWest Multicultural Services. So for those people who aren't from the Sydney area, this is the largest multicultural organisation in the outer west of Sydney. And Elka works very hard to look at the broader community and the issues of inclusion for older people from diverse backgrounds. And Elka, I've got here on my list that you were the 2017 Blacktown Woman of the Year. That's a great thing to mark up on your CV. For those people who are listening and joining us today, the short bios will be made available at the end of our webinar, as well as Myra's report. Now, I'd like to also welcome Asha, and Asha is the Executive Officer of Sydney Community Forum. That's a regional community development organisation that works with diverse communities of the Inner West, St George, Canterbury, Bankstown and the southern region of Sydney. And I think Asha's going to give us some examples today of a couple of case studies or real life stories of people that she's been working with in migrant communities who are older women. And Yumi, thank you for joining us. We're very pleased that the Older Women's Network partnered with us with this research, and Myra acknowledged the Older Women's Network. And Yumi is the manager of the New South Wales Older Women's Network. And she's done an enormous amount of work around sex trafficking of children and women, and has postgraduate degrees from universities in the UK and Australia, and is what we'd call a very global citizen. So Yumi, thank you for joining the panel discussion today. So before we get started, as a quick reminder, everyone watching, remember you can ask questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. My first question is probably to you, Myra. One of the assumptions that the report addresses is that not having children is associated with better incomes. However, it doesn't quite work that way, as we've just discussed. But I want to know, the data for this research was collected prior to COVID-19. Do you think that COVID-19 and the associated rapid social changes that we've experienced in the last 12 months are likely to have an impact, or have they exacerbated any of the issues for older women, older single women without children?
Yeah, I think that the early analysis suggests that COVID and the associated social changes are likely to have exacerbated some of the challenges experienced by older single women without children. For example, women were more likely to be affected by the loss of jobs or the loss of hours of work. And for single women who've lost their jobs during the pandemic, the lack of a safety net of second income to cushion the financial impacts of that mean the effects are likely to have been even greater. The early release super scheme, it was used more by men than women, the initial data suggests, but when women did use it, they were more likely to withdraw a larger proportion of their super, which is likely to have impacts for women's financial security as they age. Finally, our research suggested that older single women without children are more likely than any other group to be providing care for ageing parents. And we know that people providing care for ageing parents were hit very hard by the effects of COVID, the effects on the aged care system, the limitations in access to respite, particularly during the lockdown, but in an ongoing manner as well. They saw their care responsibilities increased in many cases. So I think this as well is likely to have exacerbated some of the challenges faced by this cohort.
And Myra, do you think, during COVID, that single older women without children, there would be more pressures put on them because of the caring responsibilities? So that whole thing of being sort of locked down if you're caring for an older parent, do you think that would have an impact on these people's own health and well-being.
Absolutely, and we saw that the impact of the lockdown on carers was particularly challenging. You know, it was really, you know, additional care responsibilities associated with having the cared for person at home more often. Sometimes their conditions were exacerbated by being at home, not able to access services, which meant that the carers' care responsibilities increased. And yet the avenues for getting support themselves were hugely diminished, particularly during the lockdown period. But in an ongoing way, carers have been very, very considerably affected. And if we look at our study, and the older single women without children told us that there were these kind of family obligations associated with the fact that they were the ones that did not have children, and others had responsibilities associated with having children. So, you know, I would speculate, and I haven't done research on this yet, that many parents saw their care responsibilities for their children increase during COVID, particularly during the initial lockdown. And the flow-on effect of that could have been even greater pressures on single women in the family without children to take on any additional care responsibilities for ageing relatives that may have arisen during or as a result of COVID.
Yes, and of course, as we're all so well aware now, it's going to be with us for quite some time. So I think the pressures on single older women regarding the management of COVID for their own lives, and also for the people like parents, is a big pressure. So Elka, can I go to you? How are things different for migrant women? I mean, or are you seeing the same issues in the communities that you're working in? Are there additional things that we need to consider when we're thinking about older single migrant women?
So Joan, firstly, allow me to congratulate Myra on such an important research, and of course, congratulations to COTA and the Older Women's Network for initiating such an important conversation. So as a multicultural provider with a range of services, and excuse my voice, I'm battling a cold, available to the vulnerable communities at SydWest, from settlement support to women and families, to homelessness support and aged care and disability support services, to name a few. I draw on our knowledge and experience working with women of diverse backgrounds on a daily basis. Migrant and refugee women, of course, face the same issues, but there is an additional layer of challenge attached to it. Aging as an older woman refugee or arriving in the country at an older age means that you will never accumulate superannuation or savings for retirement. You will never be able to own your own home, and even as a tenant, you are even absolutely unaware of what your rights are. You're also absolutely unaware of any type of assistance that might be available to you. And even if someone provides you with that information, you might not even understand the concept of it, since it doesn't even exist, back home. If you came at a younger age, you might have never been able to recognize your overseas qualifications. And gaining employment was hard enough, before COVID, as Myra suggested. In addition to, ageism, a woman from a diverse background faces language difficulties, lack of networks and local work experience, or maybe, as already mentioned, she is caring for another family member. So bouncing back into employment has now become even harder. So these challenges are real, and I'm not even touching on the topic of trauma they have to deal with, in addition to the day-to-day survival concerns we're discussing here today. This last year at SydWest, we did see a big spike in the numbers of older migrant and refugee women at risk of becoming homeless, or that had become homeless. And it is also sad to witness that the majority of our women suffer in silence because of the lack of supporting mechanisms, and that, of course, results in extreme social isolation. Therefore, although the issues sound the same on the surface, there are additional challenges, migrant and refugee women have to deal with when it comes to employment, superannuation, and financial security in general.
Elka, thank you for that. Just tell me a little bit about the impact of trauma on older migrant women without children?
So I suppose when we're talking about displaced, communities in general, as soon as, they arrive in Australia, the first few years, they have to deal with the issues of settlement, work, find employment, and, work around housing, get to learn to know the new way of life in the, host country. And when we're talking about established communities that, women that have aged, we've seen a lot of cases that the migration experiences that haven't been dealt to in the past are now surfacing. And as seniors, these women having to deal with, their own financial security, they also have to deal with the mental health that Myra mentioned, but an additional layer to that mental health is how they are dealing now with the migration experience that they were never able, to deal with in the past and discuss with anyone before.
Okay, thank you. And Yumi, from your perspective, what have you been hearing during COVID? What have older women been telling you about the impact of COVID on their superannuation, their access to housing?
Joan, first up, I'd like to thank Myra and her team for conducting this research, because it really puts into numbers what we're seeing on the ground in the work that we do daily. The number of phone calls we're receiving from single older women without children who are experiencing housing stress have increased during the pandemic. And considering we're not a housing service, we are not as well known to the general public as, let's say, Mission Australia is, this is a really grave concern. Myra has noted that housing is of great, worry for the women she interviewed. And we can see why if we look at the statistics, because currently there are more than 400,000 women over the age of 45 who are at risk of homelessness. And if you look at Anglicare's rental affordability survey this year, it showed that only 0.3%, that's 0.3% of rental properties across Australia is affordable for a single person on the age pension. If you're older, but not old enough to be on the pension, so you're surviving on job seeker, there were only 3 rental properties across all of Australia, which was affordable to you. So here in New South Wales, there are around 51,000 people on the New South Wales social housing waiting list, and the waiting times are about 5 to 10 years. And you need to be 80, that's 80 years old to be considered for priority housing based on age here. We believe this is completely unacceptable. The governments at all levels know that there's a terrible shortage of public, social, and affordable housing, and that older women, we're the fastest cohort, as mentioned by Myra, amongst the homeless. Yet it's only the Victorian government which has taken a significant step to build more housing when it injected $5.3 billion to build 12,000 new public and social housing in November last year. Has the federal government addressed this issue in its budget? The answer is no. And we want to know why there is no national plan to end homelessness here in Australia. Our experience of older women is that they tell us that there's usually nobody they can talk to at the end of a phone line. A Chinese older woman with no children who's single told us that she'll have to wait 3 weeks before she would get a phone call from a community legal center to help her with her situation. She doesn't have 3 weeks to wait because the landlord wants to evict her now. She's got no children to turn to for help to fill in forms and to make phone calls. And the fact that English is not her first language does not help matters either. So it is a big problem.
I don't know who could answer this question, but we've just got a question in the Q&A. Someone's asking, does anyone know on the panel how many older refugee and migrant women there are in Australia or New South Wales who are single older women? Do we have a figure on that? Elka or Yumi, do you know?
No, we don't.
No. Okay. Myra?
I don't have data on that, no, I'm afraid, but it's certainly something that we can look into.
Okay, all right, thank you. I think we know one of the women interviewed for the report said being single has put me at a disadvantage when getting and trying to renegotiate a mortgage because there was no backup person. So we've heard a little bit of that through Myra's research. And the data supports this statement, demonstrating that being single is associated with low levels of home ownership. And Yumi has just talked about the demise that we have in this country around options regarding social housing. And at this point, it seems like at the state and territory level, the Victorian government have put forth an idea. But, you know, if you think about the amount of funding that's going into that and the need, there's still this huge gap of numbers of people that can be supported or not supported through social housing. So, Kay, since you've been Commissioner, you've been looking at innovative ways to address homelessness amongst older people. Are there things that we could be doing to ensure that people actually don't reach this crisis point? You just need to unmute.
I'm going to get a hat that says you are muted because I keep forgetting all the time. Look, that's a very big question, and for some, there are different answers for different age groups. Yeah, we've got older women who are at risk of homelessness or facing homelessness or who are homeless, but we've also got younger people coming through because home ownership is reducing with each generation. So it's going to be worse in the future, sadly. I think we need some really creative solutions. I'm sad to say, but social housing will not answer all our questions. There'll never be sufficient social housing. And I think we've got to be much more innovative. Now, for example, there's been a group here in Victoria, it was where I live, but my office is in Sydney. And I have to tell you that older single women did worse in Victoria under COVID than any other group because we weren't allowed to visit a household. And when 90,000 single women protested, or single people protested, they said, well, you can visit another single household. Well, hello, if you had a brother and a sister-in-law, one of them had to go out when you went to visit the home. I mean, it was just crazy, some of the stuff that went on. And I think older people are still very reluctant in Victoria. People are slow to re-engage in the community, to go out to our local picture theatre is offering $5 picture of things in the this week to try and get Victorians back out. You know, I think we've all become a bit like hermits. But, you know, if we look around Strathfield and Ashfield and all those places with very large homes, sometimes with one older woman living in it who wants to stay there, wants to live there, if she were to actually put some small alterations in, for example, an extra sink and a microwave, once you put a sink in, it's an extra wet area, and lots of councils count as dual occupancy. And I've actually argued with a lot of local councils, why couldn't you have temporary dual occupancy? So it goes with the owner of the house. And then you would find, hopefully, organisations which would pair people together. And in Victoria, we had a system where they were doing speed dating, and they'd go along and say, oh, I liked number 2, and number 2 said, I like number 3. And they'd work with them to discuss whether they could actually live in the same household with separate entrances, and then do some tasks for the older person that would reduce their rent. Now, that needs oversight, of course, so people don't abuse it. But that's one possibility, and that when the person leaves the house, it might mean that the older woman can stay there for 15 years and this person is housed for some time at a lot less rent. Women's Property Initiative here in Victoria has set up its own real estate agency because a lot of older women who've been abused or suffered physical abuse or family abuse or some sort of abuse don't want to go looking at a rental property with a man, and so that all their real estate agent people are single, and they're appealing to landlords or I don't know what land persons, I don't know what we call them now, landlords and landladies, to say, would they be prepared to rent their home at a reduced rent to somebody who, and they monitor how it's being looked after. So they become a lead agent, which I think gives people peace of mind. Not only that, there's an unknown sort of measure that if a rental property is at, say, $400 a week, and the landlord only charges $300, that extra $100 can be claimed as a tax deduction for the landlord. That's not used sufficiently. And what WPI use that as the incentive to get people to reduce rent. One of the other things I think is really an issue is that we've got hundreds of thousands of women with between, and I can't actually tell you the figures because I'm negotiating with the ABS at the moment. We've never had those figures available to us. We've got them to do it, but now we've got to put some provisions. Now, this was in the 2016 census and but we can get a rough idea of how many women are there single, living alone, working, and have between $200,000 and $400,000. Now, that's not going to buy you a home. So what happens when they lose their job is they run that money down to keep a roof over their head, because what can I do with that? And what I'm looking for is to try and encourage a shared equity scheme where people can use that small, and this is not counting that super, I know, which is very much smaller for women, but the only data I could get was assets in the bank and women working alone, living, and not owning a home, renting. And if you could actually capture those women, isolate those savings, get them into shared equity, especially if they're younger and they can actually buy more shares as they go along, you can get them to pension age, where they actually can pay the rent on the part they don't own and pay the costs on the one they do. Now, I was attacked by somebody in New South Wales saying you should care about poor women and not these women. I said, but hang on, these women will be poor, they will be homeless once they don't have a job and they've run that money down. Now, it takes older people twice as long to find a job as a young person. So the real pressure is just keep a roof over my head. So one of the things I've been looking at is, can we find some way of putting services around those women, getting them into some part ownership, enabling them to buy more if they have a small inheritance from mum selling a house or somebody leaving them some money. The other thing that concerns me about this group of women is they're incredibly vulnerable to scams. To scams of people coming in and saying, we can fix your house, we can do something to your place, I'm just appalled at what goes on. And what they were doing in southeastern Melbourne was identifying places that had walking ramps up or indication there was an older person living there, and scamming them, saying, you know, your roof's got a problem, you need to, I can fix it for you, and walking off with $13,000 to go and buy the wood, and you'll never see them again, go and buy the rafters. They're vulnerable too to people preying on them, especially if they own a property, engaging with them, offering to help them, meeting them. And I heard one recently where this fellow joined the church. This woman thought that he'd be a very good tenant to have living with her, and he basically inveigled himself into her life, took a power of attorney and took her money. So I think there's a vulnerability of older women that wasn't, and Myra, congratulations on your research. It's a very understudied group, but I think they are incredibly vulnerable because they don't have someone to go to, a son that might say, hey, mum, we're a bit worried about this person. He seems to be, taking over. The other thing is that a lot of older people haven't got their enduring documents in place. And I've been trying to agitate for harmonisation of powers of attorney, as has Anna Bligh, because it's very hard to educate people about their rights, about the need to have enduring documents, and about the responsibilities of attorneys. And some people, I met a person in the country, New South Wales, who said to me, I don't have any relatives, I don't know to whom to give my power of attorney. Also, they don't know that once they've given it, they can actually rewrite their power of attorney. They think it's indelible and it's done for life. Elka, one of the things I'm concerned about is that we can't educate people from non-English speaking backgrounds about their rights and about their responsibilities, the responsibilities their powers of attorney should have. The other thing I've been concerned about is for single older women who do have families who come out on a contributory scheme, and when they're no more use in babysitting their grandchildren, they literally become women without children because their children reject them or threaten them if they don't do this or that, they'll be sent back. I've been looking at, are there ways in which you can protect that contributory scheme so that they have an ongoing source of income? And if you've got any ideas about that, that'd be fabulous. So one of the hard things is when we do research, it's the general, and Myra's research, thorough as it is, every individual in that study is different from every other individual. They're all got, we can talk about generalizations, but there's so many individual cases. They have some money or they don't have money. They have a place to rent or they don't have a place to rent. The other thing that's really concerns me is older women who use some of their resources to buy, for example, a place on a caravan park, and suddenly the developers move in because the caravan park's now in a highly desirable area, and they go out with nothing. And people who go into residential care, into retirement villages without understanding the implications of what they're doing. For example, deferred management fees, and then their niece moves to Queensland and they want to move and they haven't got enough money, they've got no mobility. So I think there's a real need for us to be able to educate, particularly older women on their own, about ways of protecting themselves for the little that they do have, those that do have something, in maintaining what they've got, not losing it to some shark in a caravan park, not losing it, their independence, because they put their 150,000, 175,000 they've got left into a one-bedroom unit in a retirement village. And I'm off to talk to the retirement village sector in Queensland, and I give them a shake-up when I do get to go visit them. I think that it's education about having your documents in place, about making sure that the little that you do have is protected, and making sure that you use all the measures. I mean, the downsizing measure to be able to put 300,000 into super. For some women, selling a very small property, putting that money into super and getting something smaller may actually mean they've got a home for life. So I think we've got to be creative about innovative things we can do. We have to be taking a role in educating older people about protecting themselves, particularly single older women.
Okay. There's a lot of issues there that you've discussed with us, or that you've highlighted. There was something that came through the Q&A about social housing, of course, isn't the answer. Of course, it's not the answer. But I think the issue is about having more supply of social housing, because if that's the only option for some people, we know that the demand is much higher than what's available.
Can I just say something, Joan?
Sure.
The waiting list is astronomical. There will never, ever
be enough.
No government of any description will state or federal, will actually get that list down, and especially as home ownership declines. So it's absolutely vital. And I just want to add one other thing that I think all your viewers should know. Some people will choose to sell a small place and put it into their niece's home on the guarantee that they're going to get accommodation. There was I discovered through two young lawyers who are very interested in elder law and succession planning, that portion that person puts into a home attracts a capital gain, or did attract a capital gain. And I raised that with Josh Frydenberg. He sent it to the tax board. They sent it back. And in the last budget, some of you may have missed it, that now if you have a family agreement, there's no capital gain on the portion that you put in. If you don't have a family agreement, it is. And it also helps people who've maybe had some sort of compensation from an accident going to stay with a brother or whatever else. So that's a measure that we've achieved that means that somebody may be able to live in their niece's home, or in a younger brother's or sister's home, but they're protected that money is not, if the relative dies and that spouse says, I didn't ever want you here anyway, out you go, and you've got no evidence you put money in, they are very at risk, especially women who are trying to use a small amount of money to get some sort of permanent accommodation. But I think it's absolutely vital that we think about innovative solutions, because to try and make sure that we don't, anybody who's got any sort of resource that doesn't get scammed or wasted, and pushes them onto social housing, because they'll go at the end of the list, which is really awful, but they do. If they've got any assets, they don't even get on the list. They don't get rent assistance. So, you know, we've it's got to be our corporate innovative ideas. I'll just give you one more example of a group in out in just west of the city here. A group of women have decided to buy some land and form a cooperative where they have their own, and the council's allowed them to subdivide. They've subdivided, I think, into 10, and they've offered to put 2 small units for people who can't afford housing onto it with them as their social responsibility as a group. And they're going to have some group places, a group laundry group. And I thought, how innovative is that, of women banding together to help other women? Now, it's pretty rare, but there's an example of something innovative. Helps 2 people, that's 2 people that are not on social housing, and 8 people who are helping their sisters who are less fortunate than they are.
Yes, okay, there's a few models around like that, and they're going to increase in terms of that innovative approach of sharing your resources so that people can be cared for in a very respectful and safe way. There's one issue that you brought up as well regarding documents, legal documents. COTA New South Wales has had, we've got a legal pathways program, which has reduced rates for older people to be able to get all of those key documents in place. It's a really, really essential service. So many people don't know. So many people are afraid of it. It all sort of comes down to people's notion of what death literacy is, having those conversations. But actually getting those documents in order can really help people feel a little bit more at ease. But boy, that's hard. And we're always struggling to try and get funding for something that I think is really fundamental to people's end of life, especially those people in palliative care situations. I mean,
irrespective of your age, Joan, anybody over 18, there are good documents in place.
That's right, that's right. Sorry, I'd like to go to you, Asha. Before the webinar started, we were chatting about a couple of those examples of people that you've been working with. Can you share those with us? And then I want to talk with you a little bit about the group of international students around accessing their super. So a couple of those real life situations would be terrific, Asha. Thank you.
I think, you know, before I talk about those 2 women who were the driving force behind the affordable housing campaign in Canterbury Bankstown, I just wanted to mention how in the Indian community anyway, the shame that goes with a woman who is not married and doesn't have children, and the lack of status, social status, is a massive, massive obstacle in the community and in families, in terms of having conversations. So it's assumed that a single woman without children will be the carer for aging parents. They will also be the carer for the children of their siblings. And in the pandemic, one of my friends who is from the Chinese community contacted me, and she was tearing her hair out because she has a part-time job, is single, almost 50, and somehow it was assumed that she would also take on the caring responsibilities for her niece and nephew and see to their education needs. And she was just going demented because she said, I don't know that I'm equipped to do this. And it's that assumption that they will pick up the bits and pieces of caring within the extended family. That shame and lack of status, I think, is a really big issue that we need to somehow begin to have some discussions within the migrant communities. And we've begun that with our community anyway. In the affordable housing campaign that Sydney Community Forum spearheaded and supported, I was reflecting on who were the driving force in the community-led campaign, and the driving force in that were 2 single women without children, one from a migrant background and one who was just mainstream Anglo. The migrant background woman was living with her mother caring for her, and knew that when her mum passed away, the property would be sold and that she would find herself homeless because her portion of the property would not be adequate to buy her own place. And she'd been caring for her mum for 20 years since her father died. She had a casual job in childcare, which is one of the lowest paid jobs for women, you know, that we know of. It's so undervalued in society. And she was in her 50s, and she was one of the driving forces, and the other one was a woman in her 60s who was on a disability pension because she had a chronic illness, and she could not, and she was on the verge of homelessness. She was sharing her bedroom with a curtain in the middle with an international student so that she could afford somewhere to live. And it was striking that they worked really hard and told their personal stories, their testimonies, to get those numeric targets of affordable housing in the CEP 70 legislation that the local council has some control of. And that's a provision so that all new housing developments will have allocation of 15%, 10% for in perpetuity for affordable housing, usually given to a social housing provider. We won that campaign, and both women said to me, we did this in the hope that all single women without children will benefit from this, even if we don't in our lifetime. And that was really sad for me, because actually it's true, they will be the lowest priority on any list for housing. They don't have children, so they won't meet the priority list for facts anyway. In terms of international students, I think what was really difficult for the international students that we've been working with and are still working with was those who actually went to draw on their super because they became unemployed and still had tuition fees to pay. And by the way, these are all mature age students. They've come here to do a master's degree, to do a postgraduate degree, or to study English, and they already have postgraduate degrees from their country of origin. Somebody who's here has a PhD and worked as an academic, and she's come here to learn English because she wants to teach here and understand teaching in the context here. She's from Latin America, and she's a woman in her 40s. What they discovered, so many of them, was that there was no super paid for them. The employer had just somehow omitted to pay super for them. So there was no super to draw on. And that, for us, was extremely difficult in terms of how do we go about supporting them when they are left with this shocking realization, actually, I don't have anything to fall back on. So one of the young people in her late 20s had been working here for 3 years, and when he went to draw on his super, there was no super. So I think that's fairly common in the gig economy, in the informal ways in which international students are employed, the cash in hand jobs, but also in jobs where the employer underpays them because they don't know what the minimum wage is. They don't even know there's a minimum wage. And our work has been to actually link up with all the support services and the unions New South Wales, so that they're able to understand what their rights are and to be paid what is fair, which is, the minimum wage in this country, but also to know how to look for the evidence that their super is being paid, because they didn't know that they needed to have some evidence of the super fund in which that was being paid into. So I think the exploitation of vulnerable people, this is an extension of the exploitation of single older women without children that have no status in society.
But,
or low status.
Low or no status, that's right. So Asha, how are we going to address some of those systemic issues from your perspective? What do you think?
So we've been working with the community legal centres, but I think that the responsibility here actually lies with the government. I think the lack of real deterrence means that employers who are likely to exploit people will get away with it. There aren't hefty fines The process is really onerous. It falls on the shoulders of the people who are already struggling. And I think that there's a really quite a significant policy gap when it comes to these things. And the government has a tendency to say, there isn't enough evidence that this is actually happening on a larger scale. It's an exception to the rule. And what we've been doing is actually gathering the evidence, as has Redfern Legal Centre and the community legal centres and the solicitor that works with Unions New South Wales, to actually start gathering that evidence and bring that to decision makers to say, it's important that you address this because it's a significant issue that is currently going below the radar. Yeah.
Absolutely, Asha, thank you. Yumi, I was just going to come back to you and just talk a little bit about, we've talked around affordable and accessible housing for this group of people, for older women without children. And Kay's brought up some innovative models of housing. From your perspective, are you looking at different housing models that could help this group of older women without children?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about alternative models of, for housing, and Kay has definitely touched on some of them, like, you know, a group of women banding together. They don't have enough money individually to buy property in their own right, but together they can buy something and fashion a small community around themselves. And there are also individuals, we get a lot of calls and emails from people who have a room in their house that they want to rent out to an older woman experiencing financial hardship. And then we've got, you know, the Women's Housing Company, for example, that's providing accommodation for older women. What we would like to stress is that, you know, these are all drops in the bucket. All these alternative models of housing calls for government investment and government intervention. Let me give you an example. Before COVID struck, we held a little discussion group with some older women to thrash out the idea. Would you be prepared to share your house with a complete stranger, another older woman who is housing insecure, to come and live with you? And the answer is this: it is a tentative yes, because there are so many factors involved. You know, what if they don't like pets? What if they're noisy? You know, what if they bring a lot of friends over? What if something goes wrong? So while there are, you know, many good ideas for alternative models of housing, we cannot allow, you know, we cannot depend on individual initiatives and small groups to solve what is in effect a national crisis. And we need to have a national homelessness strategy that deals with all of these things, that can provide the legislative and logistical infrastructure to support these people who want to do things like that. You know, so if we were to run a service that enables other people to rent, to share their homes, so it calls for funding, it calls for oversight, and all of this is, you know, something that only governments can support to get it off the ground and to get it to run successfully. One thing we are calling for is for the New South Wales government to fund a specialist housing service for older people, so which by default will also include older women. And it should be modeled on something that's already run in Victoria called Home at Last. It's a service where older people can go to just one place and receive assistance with their housing. It's not advertised as a homelessness service, although it does provide services for homeless older people. It's much more than that. It provides case management and advice. It prevents older people from falling into homelessness. So if this service were to be set up here in New South Wales and around Australia, it will be able to handle such cases as the one where, you know, an older woman who rang us recently told us that she knows she's going to be homeless at the end of the year when her employment finishes up because she won't be able to afford to pay the rent on her pension. So if we had a home at last service in New South Wales, it would mean that she's able to go there now and be provided with advice on what she can do immediately so that she can get herself housed before she has to sleep in her car.
Yumi, could you send us a link around the Home at Last
Yes.
model or project? Yes.
Yes.
So tell me, is it a trial in Victoria or is it up and running and it's all happening?
Yes, it is not a trial. It is up and running. And it is one of the things that we need to understand is that some of the older people who are falling into housing insecurity have never, ever in their entire lives had to go to any government service to ask for help. So having a service that doesn't stigmatize them, that doesn't say this is the homelessness service, will go a long way to encouraging them to look for help when they need it before they really need it. So, you know, it's hard for older people to acknowledge that they're homeless. We have older women who don't, you know, find it difficult to say that they're homeless because they're living with their kids, you know, they're shuttling between kids during the year. It is a problem because of this too.
Yes, I've just found out also that we've just put up a link to Home at Last. So those people who have joined us or who are still with us, you can have a look at that link and that'll give you some information. Elka, can I go to you? And I just want to talk a little bit more about this whole issue of unpaid work. And we know that, you know, it's mostly done by women and especially caring for family members. We talked about the issue of aging parents being cared for by single women without children and how that affects the earning potential of many women. Can you share with us what you've seen in the women that you work with around the caring responsibilities and the impact on poverty and family carers' health and well-being?
Of course, it's definitely an issue amongst many cultures where caring can be an expectation that might not even need to be articulated. And as all of us know, 99% of the time, of course, it is gendered. So caring for a refugee or a migrant woman that needs to attend English classes limits her ability to learn the language. Therefore, it limits her ability to establish networks, to prepare herself to become job ready and then, you know, look for a job. And for those few women that might feel empowered enough to challenge the cultural status quo, they also face the danger of becoming ostracized from their own communities. So establishing, you know, those social networks is already challenging enough, let alone taking the risk of becoming an outsider from the only community you know and you feel comfortable in. All these limitations, of course, impacts, you know, their earning abilities, yes. And, you know, not to mention women on temporary visas, as, you know, Asha touched upon. They're caring for grandchildren with no Medicare and access to free medical services or the ability to access any services available to the rest of us. So in addition to the financial concerns, of course, what we also see, and I'm probably repeating myself, is an increase in mental health problems within this particular group of women. And since these women are usually not connected with services on the ground due to the lack of funding directed to them, it borders to abuse, elder abuse.
I think I'll go back to you, Kay, because we, you know, this whole issue of homelessness, we've only really touched on it, and it would be, I think, a webinar in its own right. And you've come up with some, obviously, some very good examples of some innovative approaches to homeless or to housing options. Why do you think we've got more and more homeless people? Or is it, you know, when you were in government, there were homeless people and there were older women without children who was really struggling. Why do you think we have more of them now?
There are more of them because people are living longer and their resources have got to last longer. I mean, only in just one generation or two generations, I'm 9 years older than my grandmother was when she died. She was a single mother. My mother, I'm 6 years older now than my mother was when she died. So those of us who are I'm a war baby, and baby boomers are living significantly longer than our parents. And I don't think, you know, people lived much shorter lives, and home ownership was much higher amongst our parents and grandparents' generation. So as you get people living longer, you've got this intersectionality of people living longer, of more divorces, and all the data shows that women who are divorced end up with fewer assets than a woman who's widowed later in life. And that's another area where women do very badly in terms of outcomes in family arrangements, because they're the ones who end up spending their money helping to rear children. But we're talking about single women at this stage, where even if they fall out of a marriage without children, they end up worse off and most probably finding it difficult to get back into the workforce. So I think there's a whole lot of factors that have made it and compounded it. And we've had an increase in mental illness as well, I think, in terms of people not coping with some of the things they're facing. So there's pressure from men on housing as well, and homelessness services. So I think that's been exacerbated by all those things.
So what do you think of that? Sorry, I was just going to say, well, therefore, what do you think are what would be the best levers that we should be concentrating on for this group of?
I don't think there are best levers. I think, and I was a bit concerned about one of the panelists making a comment, oh, that's just a small thing, it's a drop in the ocean. I don't think that was the word that was used. Every single person you salvage and get into housing is one less person that is homeless. And there's been some really interesting projects. For example, we had a project here for people who had profound mental illness. And it was a 3-year project funded by both sides of government. 2 different governments funded it, where you had lead agent, the Schizophrenia Foundation of Victoria, which became Wellway, which is now in New South Wales, where they actually guaranteed people 3 years of housing as a lead agent and helped them get back on their feet to actually, and they took their rent assistance and 1/3 of their pension, and they paid the gap and said, by the time the 3 years are up, we want you back on your feet, paying the gap yourself, but we'll stay as the lead agent. In 18 months, 72% of those people were housed and paying the gap. They remained the lead agent. So if they got behind in their rent, they knew within a week. Didn't take the agent 2 months to tell somebody that and they were able to stabilise them. That was people who were profoundly ill. And I said to Elizabeth Crowther, who ran that program, do you think that would work with older women, that we could get them stabilised, especially if they still have working capacity? She said, yes. So there are a myriad of answers that only help a few people. But if we don't actually try and do that and throw up our arms and say it's only a small number, then I think we'll lose the battle, because the battle is increasing all the time as fewer people have home ownership. That's the thing that really concerns me. When I first wrote the paper 4.5 years ago, not many people were talking about women at risk of homelessness. My local council did a project 10 years ago looking at women renting, living alone, and whether they're at risk of homelessness. When they asked them, what do you think will happen? They said, oh, something will happen. It was as if they blocked off the fact that they could face homelessness. And people said, oh, we won't have homeless people in Surrey Hills and Hawthorne and Kew. Yes, you do. And yes, you have people at risk of homelessness. And I think we've come a long way in understanding, and Myra's research is very important to highlight and it's great that COTA has worked on this, and Myra's research highlights it, because I don't think the policymakers have really quite got it yet either, that they need a plethora of responses to this. And it means preventing homelessness, dealing with homelessness and thinking about the things you can do. Now, somebody else wrote one of the things, oh, but if you rent your house to someone, there's tax implications. Yes, but also if you provide board, the tax implications reduced or disappear. People might not want to do that. But I think that all those things have to be looked at. And I think the governments have to provide some incentives for people to do shared housing, to be involved in shared equity, because it's a much cheaper alternative than social housing, and it reduces the pressure on social housing. So I think we need some government, local council, government at all levels, state governments, thinking creatively about the solutions that can actually provide housing first. I'm a housing first person. You know, I was Minister for Social Security. I kept emphasising to the public servants, housing first is the way to reduce mental illness, to reduce the cost on the health bill, all those things. The health bill for those people who are floridly ill reduced significantly. They weren't visiting the hospital with chest infections and ulcers and all sorts of things that they were coming to with homelessness. So one of the things we've got a problem with these silos, where the housing people don't actually get evidence to the health people about this is going to cost the government a lot less in the end and make people's lives happier and more secure, and the benefits to the individual, let alone the benefits to the taxpayer.
Mm-hmm. Myra, I know that you just sort of didn't touch on recommendations in your report, but are there a couple of big policy changes that you would recommend from what you found out that we can all start to lobby governments about?
Yeah, we did come up with a series of policy. Policy suggestions. We talked a lot about affordable housing, but we've talked about that a lot today. So I'll talk about some others. In workplaces, we actually suggested that anti-discrimination legislation be amended to make clear that discrimination on the basis of not having family responsibilities is prohibited, because currently the wording of the discrimination legislation, the Sex Discrimination Act, prohibits discrimination on the basis of having family responsibilities, but not of not having family responsibilities, because of these stories we heard about employers asking people without children to do additional tasks and so on. And so we think the amendment to the Sex Discrimination Act would be reasonably, a small thing to do, but would need to be accompanied by kind of education of employers about what it means. We also talked about support for carers. We know a lot of older single women without children are caring for ageing parents and family members with a disability or illness. Carers currently have quite limited support to manage their care responsibilities, additional respite to alleviate some of the pressures on carers in terms of their health and well-being, better replacement care to help them manage their care responsibilities and their paid work. And finally, we recommended changes to the way the aged care system functions, because currently we're seeing this huge shift towards supporting people to stay in the community as they age. But really the community-based aged care system is underpinned by a sort of implicit assumption that older people have family around them to help them continue living in the community. I mean, even if you have an aged care package, we know family carers are really heavily involved in navigating the system, helping the services to be arranged, making sure they're operating effectively, filling the gaps when the home care package doesn't allow for certain things that an older person needs. And so what we're seeing is that people who live alone, people without immediate family around them, are hugely disadvantaged in the way the system currently operates. And it was very reassuring to see in the budget recently that there was funding for community care navigators. I can't remember what they were called. And COTA New South Wales, of course, runs the excellent Aged Care Navigator program. But we think more work needs to be done to support older people to live in the community who don't have immediate family around them to support them have their needs met.
And I think, Myra, there's Elfa's nodding, Asha's nodding, Yumi's nodding, and I think Kay was nodding as well too. So those policy areas that you've highlighted in your report, we need to all keep working together on them.
Joan,
well, folks, yes.
One thing. Somebody was talking about tiny houses. In Victoria, the government identified some land that was going to have a railway on it. Well, you know how long it takes railways to be built. and had been empty for, I don't know, yonks. And I don't know, they've actually established some tiny houses. There was an outcry from people. Oh, fancy asking people to live in tiny houses. And I thought, isn't that better than being on the street? They could have their own dog. They might be there for their whole lives, because, you know, I think I'll be dead and gone long before anybody who uses that railway land. But I think there's a lot of land around the churches. We've got a church just near me with a 35 car park that when I walk past and there's 2 cars in it, I think, oh my heavens above, couldn't we be using for affordable housing some of the church land and some of the land, council land above car parks for affordable housing? I think the local governments have got a lot to do, and also to allow good developers to actually, and I'm working with a young fellow in New South Wales at the moment who's actually trying to get the local council to give him an extra story with $2 to $3 million penthouses to provide homes at $500,000 for women at $150,000, and to have 10 project independence housing as well for young people with intellectual disability. I will be shocked if that council doesn't give them the 2 extra floors, because with that, in that one with a car park, they have a car park. If they want to have it without a car park and sell it to someone else, reduces the cost even further. That brings it within the scope of somebody to own their own home. And I think there've got to be demands on developers to actually provide affordable housing, and also to use unused space like the railway places. So I think there's a lot more innovation and will that's needed to get councils and state governments and federal government to think more creatively about this. What is an ever expanding issue? Just to say to COTA, fantastic for drawing this to people's attention.
Well, thank you. Well, on that positive note, Kay, I think we're going to have to sadly draw our webinar to a close. Myra, we thank you sincerely for your research. It's just been amazing, and I've really enjoyed listening to you, Asha, and to you, Elka, and to you, Yumi, and especially to you, Kay. I know we're all very busy, but it's great to have the Commissioner join us around this particular issue, because it is so important. And we've only really touched the surface, especially when we're looking at migrant women and refugee women and our First Nations women. You know, that we could keep talking and talking about different groups of people, and older women with disabilities as well. So Yumi, we also thank the Older Women's Network for being a partner with us in this particular webinar today. So thank you to you. I'd like to thank all of the speakers, and I'm clapping here on behalf of all of the people that have joined us today. Just to let everyone know that now, because of all the things that have happened in 2020, COTA New South Wales is running a whole range of webinars on issues that are very important. And so our next one is going to be about the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And I'd really like you to advertise that. There are details on our website, and that will be on Thursday, the 17th of June. A very important discussion. We often leave our First Nations people behind, but we really want to focus on issues of First Nations people and what people think about the Uluru Statement from the Heart. So thank you again, everyone. Hard topics, but we did it, and guess what? It's 12. It's 12 o'clock. So thank you once again. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I really, really appreciate all of the input. So thank you.